We've learned other things. We've learned, I would submit, in the last 10 years how incredibly slowly our societies crawl towards truths which should be self-evident. We have spent the last 10 years still going around the circumlocution of whether or not Islam is a religion of peace. We have had so many variations on this circumlocution now, and I keep a small notebook that's pretty much filled with them. My favourite is the movement from "this terrorist attack has nothing to do with Islam" to "it has nothing to do with Islam and Islam is in any case a religion of peace," to Barack Obama's best hit ever, which came last year after an American hostage was decapitated in Syria, and Barack Obama said, "It not only doesn't have anything to do with Islam, it has less to do with Islam than any other religion." So, if somebody cuts off someone's head while shouting Allahu Akbar, the Buddhists should get it. We learned in January this year that absolutely everybody seemed to be Charlie. We learned that Mahmoud Abbas was Charlie. We learned that every politician who has spent the last 10 years calling cartoonists inflammatory and Islamophobic and right-wing and fundamentalists and Enlightenment fundamentalists and troublemakers and so on was Charlie for about an hour. Because we learned very soon after that almost nobody was Charlie. We learned in the end, sadly, that even Charlie wasn't Charlie, when earlier this year, perfectly understandably, surviving members of the staff of Charlie Hebdo said they didn't want to keep drawing Mohammed.
Just quickly, I mean, of course this is a young men issue. I mean, I think Dax chronicled every single person in the US and UK who's been convicted of terrorism-related offences in this regard in the last 15 years. The overwhelming majority are young men. Of course we're dealing with young men. But you can't then ignore the fact that for them, whether you like it or not, whether we like it or not, for them, an interpretation of Islam is the reason that they are doing this. Now, for us, this is the most appalling interpretation of Islam. For Muslims, it's the worst possible interpretation of Islam. But it is an interpretation, and that's why, although it's more convenient for us to pretend that this has nothing to do with Islam, we do have to accept that it does in order for Muslims and others to fight against the interpretation that people like those in ISIS and indeed your loony guest here have,
I don't think anyone's denying.
We've learned that it's incredibly slow, our movement towards the truth. But let me give you one, sorry it's early in the day and this is another very graphic example, let me give you one example of how bad that slow movement towards the truth is. 30 years ago in my country we had legislation put in place to make it illegal to carry out female genital mutilation. To date, there has not been one prosecution for this that's been successful. It took, indeed, until a couple of years ago to have any attempted prosecution for female genital mutilation. There have been, as I say, this has been on the statute books for 30 years, and tens of thousands of British girls have been mutilated in this way. Now, I remember 14 years ago or so when Ayaan Hirsi Ali started speaking about this in Holland and others started speaking about it in Scandinavia and elsewhere. I remember about 10 years ago I published a report on FGM in the UK. Throughout most of this time, this was still a culturally sensitive, as they say, subject to talk about. And it was a difficult one. You could feel it as you mentioned it in public. In the last few years, it's become a bit easier. The Evening Standard in Britain ran a campaign against FGM. The Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, joined the campaign. All sorts of politicians from across the political spectrum came out in support of the campaign against FGM. Let me put it to you like this. If you were to select a subject which should be the easiest subject in the world to get total political and popular support for, does anything get easier than saying, we are against the mutilation of young girls' genitals with knives? I can't think of anything. That should be as easy as it gets. It should be a home run. And it's taken 30 years to even get it to being a legitimate political conversation, and one which has still had no practical repercussions. That, I would suggest, is a sign that if we are learning, we're really slow learners.
What we tend to do, unfortunately, is, Lord Winston just did it earlier on, is the thing, because it's so uncomfortable, we don't want to have the discussion. Our societies are no longer very good at discussing religion, and here comes along a religion most people are unused to in this country, and we don't know how to discuss it, we'd rather not. The fact is there are some very uncomfortable things which Muslims globally have to deal with, and have to globally have that internal discussion about. And we do not, I think, help that process. If we say it has nothing to do with the Quran, nothing to do with Muhammad, nothing to do with Islam, it does, a little bit, or a major bit in some people's beliefs, it has something to do with with that, and it's very important not to ignore that, because only by dealing with that can you actually take on the extremists. Otherwise, a young man like your lunatic guest earlier is very likely to have been told by people, there's nothing in the Quran to justify this violence. He finds a verse given to him by an extremist that shows the behead the unbeliever, and then he thinks all these other people are lying to me. We have to take on things to stop that happening.
So we have to...
I was speaking to a friend of mine just yesterday, whose father was a Holocaust survivor, and he said his father, one thing before he died, what one lesson would you take from the Holocaust? And he said, I take this lesson. When someone says they want to annihilate you, believe them. Don't think they're joking. Don't think they don't mean it. The Israeli people have reason not to want or need you and your opinions on their future. In 1973, when Israel, 6 years after the previous attempt to annihilate it as a state by its neighbours, once again saw its neighbours' armies amassing on the borders, the Israeli government wanted to strike preemptively to stop that war. They didn't. They didn't, among other things, because they knew that if they did strike preemptively, America would not provide them with any munitions. Kissinger said this himself afterwards. So they waited, and they were attacked, as they knew they would be, and they lost many good people. But they were then able to retaliate. They were then able to push those armies out of Israel. But, and this is a crucial thing to remember, the American planes were not allowed to land and refuel, bringing supplies to that country when it was on the brink of being ended. Were not allowed to land in any European country, even to refuel. When Israel was about to be ended, you couldn't even stop a plane for a couple of hours on European soil, because the Europeans cared more about the oil deals they were doing with Arabs than they did about the future of that state. Since October 1973, not a single Israeli has thought seriously that when they were about to be annihilated, you or any Europeans would lift a finger, and they knew you wouldn't, and they were right to know you wouldn't, and you wouldn't. When Israel is pushed to the situation it will be pushed to, of having to believe they mean it, and when every bit of jiggery-pokery behind the scenes runs out, and when the UN and distinguished figures have run out of time, and Iran is about to produce its first bomb, Israel will strike. Every single country, including this one, people from our elegant diplomatic service, people from America, everyone will condemn Israel. Everyone in the Middle East will condemn Israel. And they will go back to their homes and they will say in private, thank God for Israel. The Saudis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians, the Libyans, the Lebanese, everybody will say, thank God they did it, because nobody else would. The proposition being put before you tonight is that you have a choice between war and an Iran with the bomb. You have a choice, as has been said before, between war and dishonor. You'll choose dishonor this evening and you'll get war. You have the choice between a war with a nuclear Iran or a war at some point with an Iran that is not nuclear, which you stop from ever being nuclear, and hope that in stopping that regime, in embedding itself, you will give the Iranian people the best chance they will have of overthrowing that regime. But as I say, thank God this doesn't rely on you or any Europeans, because you've made the same mistake before, and nobody should trust you to get it right this time.